In this video, we'll be going over the basic Python X plate installation. Make sure to map out the area in which the Python X plate will be placed and make sure that there's free range of motion all around the machine. Realize that both sides of the gantry have access panels and we'll want to make sure that we can open those fully. The overall width of the gantry is 238 inches. This does not include the open accent stores. The length of the machine will depend on the rails that you have, so make sure to accommodate for that. You will also want to make sure that the fine line and air pack will not interfere with the travel of the gantry, but are within the reach of the cables. When mocking up the rails, start by setting up your master rail with the gear rack to the outside. You will have to lay out and drill all the holes in the concrete to set up the leveling screws. Make sure to do this in a completely straight line using a chalk line. While doing this, you want to make sure that the spacing and square of the bolt holes is correct to make the next step easier. When you get your machine, you're going to set a master rail. That master rail is all measurements are going to go off the highest point of the concrete. So you have to transit that concrete, find the highest point. To get the best installation and level of the master rail possible, use 2 plumb bobs on either end of the rail and align them to the chalk line previously made during the layout. Use a transit or auto transit and precision level to get the rail perfectly leveled in the X, Y, and Z axes. Double check the plumb bobs, then anchor the rails to the leveling screws and then double check your X, Y, and Z axes to make sure all is good. If your machine has multiple rails, make sure to lay out and install all of the rails on the master side first. To connect the second rail on the master side, you'll need to roughly level and put into place as close as possible. Next, you'll have to bolt on the rack to both rails using a timing block on the rack and then level the second rail perfectly. Anchor the second rail, double check the X, Y, and Z axes, snug the bolts, and double check again. Install the machine rail on top of the rack, snug the bolts, and check the clearance between the rack and the rail. Plus, make sure the rail connection is perfectly flush. If timing, leveling, clearance, and plumb bob are all good, move on to the next rail until the master side is completely done. Once the opposite rail is set, we will want to check for level in both the X and Y and then height in the Z and keep it consistent with the master rail. We'll also want to check for square to make sure we're not creating a parallelogram and making sure that the rails are perfectly parallel to each other. Once the rails are aligned and leveled, we are now ready to place the gantry on the rails. First, loosen the gantry on the shipping brackets while the gantry is still on the ground. This will make it safer to remove the brackets before placing the gantry onto the rails. Then, perfectly align the roller cassettes to the guide rails before placing the gantry's total weight onto the rails. So what we're looking at here is our gearbox. The sprocket here can only fit on the gear rack a certain way, so we have to make sure that the gearboxes are on the right side. You'll notice this cylindrical part that hooks to the motor itself will be facing the front of the machine and will be up. We'll have some bolts that slide right through these holes, and we'll have a spacer that goes in between the gearbox and the gantry itself when we mount it. Now, you will want to put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and on this sleeve of the gearbox itself. Before installing the motor, make sure the gantry is in the back end of the rail, since this will be the last time that you'll be able to move it easily. You can then mount the motor to the gearbox. Make sure that the set screws are out of the way for easy installation. Make sure to tighten them down after the motor is installed. Okay, once we set the motor into the gearbox, we want to make sure that the cables are able to plug in towards the top of the motor so that the ports are going to be pointing up. Okay, we're going to have 3 different cables. These 2 will go into the motor, and then we'll have the ground, which will go on the gearbox. That's going to need a 17mm wrench. Now, before you start hooking everything up, we are going to have to use a 6mm Allen and tighten the set screws on the coupler connecting the motor to the gearbox itself. So make sure to align those before you put the motor in. Once those set screws are tightened inside the gearbox to the motor shaft, we can go ahead and put these little caps on top of those. Now remember, there is a set screw on the top and a set screw on the bottom. Make sure to tighten both of them and put both caps back on. Before running the wires and cables into the gantry, make sure to remove all of the side panels around the power control box using a 5mm Allen wrench. Now that the gantry is in place with the motors connected, we can set the cable carrier track in place under the power control panel. Once this is done, we will feed all of the cables from the cable carrier track into the gantry housing. This will include all of the gas hoses, ground and power cables, and plasma and computer connections. Once the cables are fed through, we can attach the cable carrier to the gantry. So we're going to find a few ground cables with all of our cabling from the cable carrier rack. They're going to be labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll also have a pilot arc cable and a real big ground cable that will all go into this gray box that you'll have to take the cap off and then wire up. Everything will be labeled, so it'll be very easy to plug in. Once you're done, go ahead and put this lid back on. And as you can tell, we're going to have to take these two side panels off of the machine in order to finish up all of our wiring. So once we've got the orange control panel cable into the control panel, we're going to have 4 cables that we're going to want to plug in. The thicker 4 are going to be your power cables, and they'll be labeled L1, 2, and 3, and then you'll have your ground. L2, 1, 2, and 3 will be right here and labeled 1, 2, 3. The ground will go right up here into the ground lug. So the 4 smaller cables will be labeled 5, 6, 7, and they will go right here, and those parts are labeled 5, 6, 7, where you're going to put those in. Now in order to tighten those cables down, you'll need a very small flathead screwdriver for the 5, 6, 7, a 4mm Allen for the line 1, 2, 3, and then a larger flathead screwdriver for the ground. All the gas hoses coming into the machine will be labeled themselves, but on the receiving end on this wall, they will not be labeled. There are only 2 hoses that can be switched around. All the other ones have their own unique threads. Those 2 hoses will be the plasma marking and the plasma gas. You'll notice that the plasma marking has a black rubber band, more or less, on one end. You'll also have the same black rubber band on the back side. That makes sure so you get the correct connection. Other than that, the fittings with the notches are reverse thread. The ones without notches are regular right-handed thread. And make sure to use 2 different wrenches, one on the back and one on the front, while tightening these in order to make sure so it doesn't slip. On the right-hand side of the control box, you will find the plugs for the computer connections. These will be a large square plug and 2 Ethernet plugs. Right here on this, inside this panel, we'll have 3 ground leads. This top one will be your nozzle. The one on the left will be your work lead going to the table. And this one down here will be your electrode, or going to the torch. So inside here we also have our interface cable and our arc link cable. When setting up your air pack, make sure to connect the incoming and outgoing air hoses, then plug it into the nearest wall outlet. We don't want to forget to put on the felt washers and covers onto the cassettes of the gantry. You'll only get 4 felt washers, so you're going to want to put those on the outside of the cassettes of each one. Very easy to put these on. They're a little tight, but make sure you get them in there. Once the felt washer is in, we're going to put the cover on. You're going to want to put the gray side facing out. There it is. Before you put your covers in, make sure that all the cabling is up off the ground and you're not dragging anything. Make sure we've got some zip ties positions here and just keep it all nice and clean. The panel on the left will have these notches, the other one will not. So this emergency shutoff cable will mount just like this in these access panels. and then string all the way around. We also have these covers on the ends. The hole will be on the bottom, and the bolt holes, the fit configuration will only go one way. This video went over a basic installation of the Python X plate. The last step is going to be to hook up your computer, turn everything on, and make sure it connects. Follow the instructions that pertain specifically to your machine bed, which can be either a water table or a downdraft.